Right, thank you for that. Okay, so first of all, I would say that we had no rebellions in our group, and my big thanks have to go to Julie for her great leadership in taking us through the session. Just reflecting on what John was saying about disciplines in the academy, etc. I started life off as a natural scientist, so words like thermodynamics and entropy were tripping off my tongue without a blink of an eye. When somebody once asked me if I was a social scientist, I asked them, why did I ask that? And I said I was using words like normative and epistemology without blinking an eye. And last night, I was accused of being an economist because I was using words like discounting and rational actors and stuff like that. So I don't know what I am these days. Right. So we had a fantastic discussion yesterday, and I really do want to pay tribute to the whole group. We went through the process that we'd been asked to, and it worked really well. And we had a number of very key themes came out from the opening session, which we've already heard reflected. The notion of dealing with complexity and looking at synergies, taking a systems view of things, focusing in on maintaining choice and opportunity and ensuring that action stemmed from what Jeremy was saying about this notion of wise choices or wise decision making. The idea of having to take a long-term view, the idea of having to look at the big picture, and the idea of ensuring that people had agency to actually act and to see that their action would actually have some impact. We focused around notions of resilience, both of resilience of ecosystem processes and the resilience of societal choice-making systems. And we also talked about the notion of adaptation and I suggested that actually it's the wrong word, or it's the wrong form of the word, because it's a noun that sort of implies that there's a thing called adaptation that you can define and point to and say, ah, yes, that's adaptation. Actually, it isn't. It's a verb, and it's a continual verb that never has an end. It's about adapting or being adaptive. So that said, we then moved into the main session, and we talked about the research gaps, and we had a very broad, very wide-ranging conversation. And just before we finished, I asked people to go for a comfort break, and I would spend a few minutes trying to reflect on what I'd heard, and then feed it back to them before I stood up here this morning in the lion's den. And fantastically, nobody threw anything at me or shouted at me when I fed back what I'm just about to feed back now. So I assume that unless anybody's changed their minds, it does represent the consensus of the group. I have two slides, and really these two slides represent the two areas that we were talking about. The first is, what should a biodiversity research or futures research agenda look at? Oh dear. What have I said? And basically, we said it needed to cover the full span of the steep typology. For those who are not familiar with this, I apologise. In the futures world, it's fairly standard stuff. You might have heard it as PEST or PESTLE or steeple or other such acronyms. To my mind, STEEP works. What it stands for is essentially the domains of society. We can talk about social, technological / scientific, economic, environmental and political. So we needed to ensure that the biodiversity futures research agenda covered the full span of those sort of categories. And obviously the boundaries between them are fairly fuzzy and they don't always work, but it helps. Again, we had a very strong steer and a very strong emphasis coming through on the notion of behaviour and cultural change, looking both at direct routes for establishing that, but also as indirect routes about whether or not we could get people to engage with biodiversity futures through other salient issues such as health. And we asked the question, are there social tipping points as well as ecological tipping points? And interestingly, one of the points that was made was around the idea that actually for the last 10 or 15 years we've been starting to put so many more young people through an education that includes environmental issues in it. And so we're creating essentially an alumnus of environmentally aware young people. Is that going to get to a social tipping point whereby suddenly the consciousness of the planet suddenly sort of takes us into a new space? You know, maybe, who knows? We looked at issues around what I've referred to here as anticipatory governance. Is a bit of a techie word, but essentially what it means is the idea of prior assessment technologies or techniques for looking at plans, policies, programs, etc. So what sort of is in the toolkit for prior assessment? We have a lot of tools already. We have environmental impact assessment, we have strategic environmental assessment, we have ecosystem service valuations, we have cost-benefit analysis, real options appraisal, etc. There's lots of things in the toolkit, but is the toolkit fit for purpose? Is there anything missing from that toolkit? What else do we need? Do we need to refine those tools? We need to understand language and communication. So maybe we do need the poets. We need to understand how words like biodiversity, ecosystem, nature, natural, etc. actually play out in the discourse. So there's a clear humanities agenda there, alongside the social science and the natural science. We need to look, in the economic world, we need to look at innovative funding sources and mechanisms and how they may work. And in the natural science field, we need to look very closely at ecological limits, but actually recognise that they're not entirely biophysical in their origin, that a lot of them are socio-political themselves. They're matters of risk or tolerance of acceptable risk, etc. But how are they defined, how are they constructed, how are they put into operation? The second area that we looked at was more to do with how the research itself should be carried out. So it's essentially the structures and infrastructure of the research agenda itself. So again, we looked into the toolkit. And remember Angela's talk yesterday? She showed a toolkit with screwdrivers and scenarios and that sort of thing in it. So the question is that futures toolkit fit for purpose? We looked at the span between scenarios and visions and forecasts and projections, etc. Are the tools there actually up to the job? What sort of linkages can we create to decision making? How can we actually start to use these things to help us roadmap our way to the future? And what sort of flags or early warning systems can come from those tools that actually tell us whether or not the direction we're headed is actually right or wrong. We need to think about embedding a systems thinking capability, dealing with complexity and nonlinear feedbacks. We need a lot more good and relevant case studies, obviously clearly communicated so people can see relevance to what they're doing. Again, reinforcing what we've already heard from John about interdisciplinarity, incorporating diverse forms of knowledge, going beyond the academy, and particularly looking at indigenous knowledge as well. And a very, very strong emphasis coming through on the need for knowledge exchange or knowledge brokering, for it to be powerful and for it to be effective, for it to work in two ways between the academy and society. It needed to be global so that you could actually learn lessons and disseminate knowledge all over the world. And we needed to make sure that it had impact, and there was an emphasis on making sure we had better use, or we could make better use of what we already know. So the research agenda isn't just about creating new knowledge, it's also about ensuring that we make the better use of what we already know. So I think that's it.